Well, thank you for letting me record our conversation. I think we have good talks. And I think, what did you name it? Coffee and Combos with Kimberly. So
Yes.
we're gonna go with it. That's gonna be the thing. So when we were just talking, you said something that I thought was interesting as a way to get into the conversation. We were talking about education and therapy and doing spiritual work, and you said that they are all a way to get to the next version of you. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. I think in what we were just talking about was, how these all impact us and what each of those spaces contributes to like who you are, how you show up in the world. And I think college for sure, education, higher education, being away from home, meeting new people, new experiences, challenging yourself in a different way. Um, that also shows up in how we interact with people in a spiritual space, whether that's church or mosque or synagogue. Um, you know, those people and those experiences shape who we are, and expose us to new things. Um, Same way with like therapy. I'll say you with therapy, it's more of a moving backwards kind of things where you have to kind of like start where you are and think back to the things that have impacted and shaped who you are to get you to this place. And if there's something that needs to be moved or changed, you can kind of sort that out in the therapy space.
Go back to education because I thought the way you talked about that was interesting for me. So I'm from Delaware originally, and I first got an associate's degree in nursing in Delaware.
Mhm.
And then I came down to DC to go to Howard to get my bachelor's degree. And so it wasn't just college per se, it
Right.
truly was moving to DC
Mm.
that my world shifted. I was away from my family, I was away from my original community.
Mm.
The women of color that I was seeing doing powerful things in DC was mind blowing. The
Mm.
School of Nursing at Howard was predominantly Black females running everything.
Right.
Sharon Pratt Kelly was the mayor of DC at the time. And
Mm.
so everywhere I looked, there were these powerful Black women, and I didn't remember seeing that at home. If I
Mhm.
did, it didn't register.
Right.
But to be immersed in a place where my color didn't determine what I had access to or what I could do.
Yeah.
And being a woman wasn't a barrier either,
Mm.
was mind blowing to me. It was just kind of like, oh, wait a minute. You mean I could do anything? I could
Mhm.
be anything? Was and so it wasn't, it was college that got me here, but it
Mhm.
was the context and experience, the people that I was meeting from different countries.
Right.
Let's be truthful, the clubs that were here in DC, this is kind of like all of that kind of opened up my world in a way that I don't think I would have experienced if I had gone to college in Delaware.
Yeah. Um, I 100% agree with that. So I I very clearly remembering my senior year in high school, like itching to get out of Indianapolis. Like I just felt like I've been here and done it. I need to move on. Don't ask me where that came from, but I was ready to go. And um just the thought of like staying in Indianapolis because we had opportunities for I think I don't remember exactly what it was called, so I'm gonna butcher it, but it's some kind of like Indiana Scholars. If
Mm-hmm.
you hit a certain GPA, you can go to school locally for free, or at least, some type of discounted tuition. But I remember just thinking like, I don't want to do that because I feel like I'm going to miss out on something. And so the idea of being able to like leave and go to college was so appealing. And I know that that has a lot to do with my grandfather who went to an HBCU he went to Jackson State University in Mississippi. And so that's all he ever talked about my whole life. And so I just knew I'm like, well, I've got to go to an HBCU. which one I don't know. I wasn't going to Jackson because I knew he was going to be watching me the whole time. But um getting to Grambling, which was a long way from Indiana, like I had no idea that that's how far I was going to go. But being there, being in a place where I probably would not have selected that just based on location, if I knew what I knew after I got there. But the experience was like nothing I can even put into words. And I think similar to your story, it wasn't so much that I was seeing people in powerful positions as much as just thinking about like where this is going to take me. Because watching my grandfather and his circle of other, college educated friends, like they did everything. They had travel groups, they had book clubs, they did all kinds of things, and they were very impactful in their communities. So
Okay, but wait a minute, because you and I have talked about this, and I am still encouraging you to write a book. But I like when you keep saying your grandfather, like what year are we talking about? And so I do want to paint the picture of for you growing up, you were around people, educated elders. That wasn't my
yes.
experience. So I do want to make sure that we capture that because to me that's powerful.
Yeah, so like like I just recently learned, I want to say that they were graduating college in the, oh gosh, I don't even want to say because I will mess that up. Maybe mm, it was definitely the early like 50s. Um, it was at a time when Black people really weren't going to school. HBCUs were very prominent because we weren't being accepted into primarily white institutions. So between him and my grandmother was among the very first graduating class of Mississippi Valley State University. Like we just learned that on her 90th birthday last year. I'm like, Grandma Doris, like, how could you not tell anyone this? This is amazing. So they're looking for her to be like, you're a historical piece of this institution and we want to recognize you for that. So like that's where they come from. They're both from Mississippi, and Black people just didn't go to college. They were sharecroppers, or they were working domestically. And so to go to school, and my grandfather was in engineering and construction. So that was like a largely untapped space by African Americans during that time. So like I have lots of stories about all of his things because he went on to be managers of projects, and he moved my family around the country in spaces where Black people primarily were not, like Wisconsin, Missouri, a lot of pretty much around the Midwest, but that was like upward mobility for Black people at that time. And they were doing things that Black people didn't do. They were taking vacations to the Hamptons and like all of these things that usually you see in the movies. Like these are things that white people do. They vacation in the summertime, or they all these kinds of things. He owned his own business, so he was always very hands-on, making sure that we had college fairs every year. So I always attended those kinds of things. When he wanted to create this Circle City Classic to like bring HBCU culture to Indianapolis, they created the Circle City Classic. And so that is still going on to this day. And that's like a battle of the football teams and bands for a variety of HBCUs around the country. So we were among the first to do that. Now everybody kind of has a bowl game, but in the Midwest, Circle City Classic was where it was.
I
So,
can't imagine you growing up and watching that. And I know it's later that you process what it was,
yeah.
but that had to have impacted what you thought was possible for you. It's like that bar was pretty high. And so it wasn't like you were digging out of something trying to move up. you were already introduced to, yes, we do, this is possible for us. We can do this.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because there was this like side by side thing going on in that um yes, I was seeing this through my grandfather and my grandmother, like accomplishing all of these things, being very pivotal pieces of civil rights movement. I learned that too. I'm like, so you were out here protesting? Like, what is happening? Why is no one telling me this family tea? But like those kinds of things. But it was more like that was just everyday life for them. And it wasn't anything as unique as we see it as.
Okay.
So, like, I did grow up seeing some of those things, but there's a lot that I didn't learn until later. And then put that next to growing up in a single parent home where it wasn't always so easy. And there was a lot of responsibility that I had to pick up early on. So it didn't really leave time for me to like be a kid, I guess, is the the easiest way I can think about saying that. So I had to mature very quickly and think about things that probably at that age I should not have been thinking about or needing to think about. Um, so I think in that way, maybe I hate to say balanced it out, but
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, you still had stuff to work on, even though you had that incredible modeling,
right,
you still had stuff to work on. And I don't know how to segue into this, but what I was thinking is we joke a lot about being latchkey kids and needing to learn how to cook and watching
right.
cartoons and all that kind of stuff to keep yourself
Yeah.
occupied until your mom got home. But it's just kind of like that level of independence, what I thought was independence, like what I thought was grown. I thought,
Mhm.
I'm home
Yeah.
by myself taking care of things, I'm grown.
Right.
But like I said, for me moving down into DC, and while I knew how to maintain my home and maintain my bills and get up and go to work every day, I had a very strong work ethic from my family. What
Hmm.
I eventually found, my first job here was as a nurse, was that I was struggling in the
Hmm.
work environment. I was struggling with it, not only the interpersonal aspects of being a working nurse, but also the stuff that came up for me in taking care of patients, especially those who were similar in
Hmm.
background to me. And it amplified when I started doing pediatrics and seeing these young Black children who not only had a hard life, but were having a hard time in the system, in just the hospital system. And
Hmm.
so, like, that is what opened my eyes up to, whoa, like I didn't get everything that I needed in my home environment to cope with what I'm dealing with out here. And when I say cope with, I mean, something happens at work, a patient dies, or, there's a code, or there's just something very emotionally hard that happens at work.
Yeah.
And I'm going home by myself, and I don't know where to put those feelings. I don't know what to do with it. I'm journaling. I started journaling very early on. But for me, it was when I got into therapy and I
Mhm.
had another person to talk to about it. And it's a person who's not a friend and not a family member and not a, girl, you're going to be okay. But just kind of like, okay,
Right.
let's unpack why this bothers you, what it's bringing up from the past, and what might be there for you to heal. Like for me, that was where I had to admit what I didn't have
Mhm.
and to start reading books, and just doing stuff to try to fill in those pieces. I don't know that I even have the word for it now, but it was very clear that some piece was missing.
That so I think it's interesting that you say that because even though it never really occurred to me until way later, like it was all crashing down that I needed some help.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, like, so thinking about that kind of going back to your example of like being a latchkey kid and thinking, oh, things are, and I thought the same thing. I was like, you know, at that point I had got my CNA while I was still in high school. So I was like, because my, you know, my guidance counselor had just like blew my head up and she's like, oh gosh, you don't even have to work at a greasy spoon. Like you can make real money in high school. And I'm like, okay, so I'm thinking I'm doing all these great things. I'm bringing home like a lot of money at that time.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And, you know, I'm like, here, mommy, help pay this, you know, like I'm thinking I'm really grown. But then when I got to Grambling, I realized like how grown I'm not.
Right.
um, and you know, it kind of in the same vein of what you were describing, like I realized early on as I got into the nursing program, like this is going to be hard. This is going to be harder than anything I've ever experienced before. And there's this other layer of like being in the deep South, like
Mm,
Louisiana, never had that experience. Now, Indiana comes us with its own things, but you know, you just know where not to go and you don't go there.
mhm,
So that kind of shields you from some of that crazy that happens in small towns. But being right in a small town in Louisiana was quite eye-opening. And I think that was my first lesson in like recognizing that I didn't know what I didn't know because I constantly had to fight administration in our school of nursing. So unlike your experience where you're seeing like all of these high powered people that look like you,
mhm,
I see no people who look like me.
mhm,
And on top of that, they're trying to purposely pick you out and get you out of the program because they're in a way like gatekeepers. So, I mean, to me, that was my first introduction to nursing. Like, oh, is this what this is going to be like?
right.
Um, and in some ways, yes, it has. I'll say so. I feel like while it was an eye-opening experience, it was also very good because I'm not really one to like back down from a challenge. So I'm like, well, yes, let me be the, you know, the voice of my peers and represent us at the, you know, administration level. And so that, you know, again, that came from early on
That
watching
sounds
my
like that goes back to your grandfather. Yeah.
watching him do that because I'll say we'll keep all of the details of the conversations that happen behind doors. But yes, he was very much like, you know, you just don't let anybody run over you, not for reasons of like color or something like that. Um, so yeah, I'll say, and I would say kind of in the same space as I've navigated through nursing as, you know, as a bedside nurse, I think it was interesting that some of the themes that came up for me was more like going back to again, like who you know, who are your people. That was always like something that came up from my grandfather is like you want to make sure that somebody knows you because then you have kind of the concept of like having the sponsor, someone
Mhm.
talking your name in spaces where you're not. Although he didn't call it that, that's what he was describing.
Yeah.
And so for me, understanding that early on, I didn't have a language for it or words for it, but I knew the idea that it's always good to know people and for people to know you. And so throughout my career, that's kind of like where I've always gone. It's like once I come into a space, I need to know who are the decision makers. Like, let me understand some of that because that makes a difference in the experience that I may or may not have, opportunities that may or may not come my way. So,
So learning how to network is what you're sounding like to me.
yeah,
That they
yeah,
don't teach you in school.
they
And so
don't
if
teach
you
you that.
don't have that in your home, then that's a skill, that's yet another skill that you have to acquire in order
Yep.
to be successful
Yeah.
in your career.